Okay, so a little bit about Branden. Branden is a UCLA Law alum. He graduated from UC Santa Barbara undergrad, and he said for a few years he cast about in vain for entry-level philosopher positions, but when he was visited by the ghost of student loans past, which I think many of us can relate to, he knew it was time to make a change. In June 2006, Branden took the LSAT, scoring a 175, which if you don't know what the top score is for the LSAT, it's 180, so it's almost a perfect score. And thereafter, he attended UCLA School of Law, graduating in 2010 and practicing patent law for several years. Since 2013, he has taught dozens of live LSAT classes and tutored scores of successful test takers. But when he's not considering the finer points of a particularly tricky logical reasoning question or kicking it with his daughter, Branden writes science fiction. You can find him after work at the local Starbucks, typing furiously, then deleting what he typed, then typing more, and so on for hours. So Branden, so happy to have you joining us, and thank you to TestMax for also providing a free LSAT prep course to one of our attendees, which we'll be raffling after the conference is concluded. So over to you, Branden.
Thank you so much for having us, Katie, and thank you so much for that introduction. I spend less time nowadays typing furiously at Starbucks since you can't really sit down and go inside anymore. However, I do still do most of those things. So hello, everyone. I am, as Katie pointed out, a graduate of UCLA School of Law. So it's always nice to come back and be able to present to Bruins. Today, our presentation is going to be a broad overview of the LSAT. And the way this presentation is designed is something like this. If I had maybe 45 minutes to sit down with somebody and give them as much and as broad information as I could about the LSAT, and then I could never help that person again study for the LSAT, these are the things that I would tell that person. So first, we're going to talk about studying, making a study schedule, managing your time. And then I'll give you, to the best of my abilities, some tips that you can use, even if you haven't really started studying for the LSAT yet. So having said that, I have a presentation to share with you. I will do my best to keep an eye on the questions in the Q&A box. Feel free to ask as many questions as you want. If you have questions that are kind of off topic, if there's time at the end of today's presentation, I'm happy to answer those as well. So having said that, all right, hopefully you are all seeing what I am seeing. So first I want to start, yes.
Yeah, it looks good, Branden.
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. First I want to start off by saying this is the title of this presentation. It is a lot more about these guys' tips than it is about these guys. And I just want to point out that the LSAT is testing your ability to think like a lawyer. Lawyers have a very peculiar rules-based way of thinking, and you must learn to think like that in order to do well on the LSAT. That is not something that there are just a few tricks you can use to do. Studying for the LSAT is going to be a very large investment of time, at the very least, a large investment of effort, but it does pay off in numerous ways, and we can talk about those ways, or we will talk about at least some of those ways throughout today's presentation. So first, let's just talk about what the LSAT is going to do to your life as you're studying for it, and how to make sure you are prepared by test day. The LSAT will take over your life for a significant period of time. Just before we talk about what is on here, here's why it's going to take up a lot of time and take up a lot of your life. The LSAT is a test of logic and argumentation. It is different than any other standardized exam I have come across in my time. And if you don't have a background like I had, which was a philosophy background, I took a lot of symbolic logic classes as an undergrad, then most of this stuff will be brand new. You'll be starting at the very beginning. And so nailing all this stuff down is difficult enough, but you also have to nail it down and then be able to execute under some pretty extreme time pressure, which we'll talk about today as well. So all of that takes a lot of hard work, and you should anticipate that you will be putting in a lot of hard work. This number is, I think, really a minimum or a floor. And I think you should anticipate probably spending more than 200 hours studying for the LSAT. This can be broken down into about half making your way through a course and homework. I'll talk a little bit about the LSAT Max course. I'll also talk about what you should be looking for in any LSAT course, regardless of the LSAT course you choose. But your course should be comprehensive, and a comprehensive LSAT course covers a lot of stuff and takes a while. So you should anticipate about 100 hours making it through the course, making it through your homework. As you're going through your course, you definitely want to know what is working for you, what isn't, your strengths and weaknesses. And so that kind of like administrative work of studying, keeping track of what's working, keeping track of what's not working. I often have my students create question logs where they're kind of breaking down their performance question by question, at least on the questions they miss. But it is an extensive investment of time. You actually shouldn't, and here's why the second half is just as big as the first half. You shouldn't expect a whole lot of improvement in that first phase of the course. People will see some improvement, but the people who really see improvement are the ones who learn the material, but then, and this is mostly in that second phase of the course, then are able to put it all together under time pressure. And that includes not just being able to answer questions correctly, it includes taking lots of practice exams, reviewing those practice exams, and strategizing and thinking creatively about what did not go right for you, what went wrong for you, and then how to make sure that you're addressing whatever issues came up, that you're diagnosing those issues and addressing them in a way that plays to your strengths and compensates for your weaknesses. And everybody is different. Everybody has different blind spots that they have to cope with. And so this is where people really see, I think, a lot of improvement, because they take what they've learned and then they turn it into a performance. And those are two different things. So when do you start studying? That's a lot of time to put in. Obviously, you can't start studying for the LSAT 2 days before if you're going to put in 200 hours because of math. But it's different for everyone. You know, some people, lots of people, especially those who are undergrads, will study during the summer and take the LSAT in late summer or early fall. And they can sometimes, some people have at least the room in their schedule to make it a full-time job or close to a full-time job. Lots of us don't, however. Lots of us have school, work, family obligations, volunteering, other obligations. And so you have to fit in studying for the LSAT in that time. So since it is going to take you about 200 hours, there is, I think, a fairly simple equation you can do. I know we're all going to law school because equations are not our thing, but this will help you just have an idea of when you need to get cracking on studying. Take 200, about the hours that you are going to have to study, and divide it by the number of hours a week that you can realistically put into studying. Realistically. When you have done that, you divide those numbers and you will come up with the number of weeks that you need to study. For example, a very easy example is if you had 20 hours a week to study, if it was like a half-time, part-time job, 200 hours divided by 20 would give you about 10 weeks to study. I think that is probably a floor. Very few people study for the LSAT for less than 10 weeks, again, because it's a big hill to climb for most people. If you have, for instance, 10 hours a week, then you should expect 20 weeks of studying for the LSAT. To be safe, I would start no later than 4 months before the exam. That may seem like a giant chunk of your time, but again, the LSAT is important. And so it's important to do well on it. So that is what the LSAT is going to do to your life, or how you can incorporate the LSAT into your life. LSAT Max provides instruction on all of these things. LSAT Max is a comprehensive course. Like I said, there are other courses out there. You may select a different one. I would make sure as you are choosing among them, because some can seem great, some can seem very inexpensive, but you want to make sure at the very least, well, not at the very least, but you definitely want to make sure that your preparation is comprehensive. If you get awesome preparation for 1/3 of the exam, that will get you a failing score. So you need good preparation for all of these sections of the exam. So like I was saying, very broadly speaking, the LSAT is a test of logic and argumentation. And let me just explain briefly what I mean by these, and then we can talk about how these different things will fit into those two areas. And they overlap. There are some arguments on the LSAT that use logic in order to work. But here's what I mean by logic. Logic, or the way I would define logic, is this. Logic is where you take a couple of concepts and you combine them according to a set of rules in order to produce a new concept. The type of logic that people are familiar with, at least earliest in their lives generally, is math. If I were to tell you I have 2 apples, I'm going to the store to buy 3 apples, you would be able to combine those concepts and to predict with accuracy that very soon I'm going to have 5 apples, even though I never said I'm going to have 5 apples soon. That's logic. That kind of mathematical logic doesn't appear a lot on the LSAT, although there are some kind of math adjacent concepts. But that is, of the 3 sections of the exam, there are 3 sections, one called logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comp. Logic dominates logic games. It makes up a little bit of logical reasoning. It doesn't really enter into reading comp. I would say when it comes to logic, that's maybe a third of the exam is testing logic. Much more of the exam is testing argumentation. I would say about 2/3 of it. So reading comprehension, all of that is testing your understanding of arguments. Most of logical reasoning is also testing your understanding of arguments. We're not going to get too deep into how argumentation works, other than I will just briefly describe what an argument is, and then kind of the most broad ways that you're being tested on argumentation on the LSAT. An argument always consists of at least 2 parts. There's a conclusion, which is the thing the author wants to prove to you. If you're in court, for instance, and you're a prosecutor, what you would be trying to convince your audience of, what your conclusion would be, is that the defendant is guilty. So that is a very common conclusion that you would be arguing for if you were a lawyer. And there's always at least one bit of what they would call evidence when you're a lawyer. When it's on the LSAT, they call it a premise, but it's a reason to believe that the conclusion is true. So for instance, in that example, if we are trying to, I don't know, convict the defendant of running a red light, there might be a video showing the defendant running the red light. And that would be a bit of evidence. That would be a premise supporting the idea that the defendant is guilty of running a red light. So that's how argumentation works. Obviously, it gets a little bit more complicated on that, a little more complicated than that, or else the LSAT would be too easy, but that's the basic idea. There are really, broadly speaking, 2 things they're asking you to do when it comes to arguments. One is that they will give you a structure. For instance, in a logical reasoning question, you'll get a little paragraph. And what you ultimately need to find in that paragraph are these things, the premise and conclusion. But this is what it will start out looking like. They'll give you some background, a little context that helps you understand what the argument is. Maybe then you'll get the conclusion afterward. Then, because the makers of the LSAT are trying to trick you, and yes, they are trying to trick you, you'll get some kind of meaningless distraction. And then maybe down here, you get the premise. And so one very important skill, the foundational skill when it comes to argumentation, is to be able to take this jumble of things and turn it into this. In other words, to put these guys to the side, the background, the distraction, and to understand where is the meat of the argument, what is actually being argued here. That I would call argument analysis. That is a very large part of reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is a full passage. You'll get multiple arguments being made by different people. And just understanding how those arguments work, how they interact with each other is important. The other very big way that they're testing you on argumentation is they're testing your ability to be critical of arguments. This is hugely important on the LSAT. The most common logical reasoning types, logical reasoning question types, test you on what is wrong with arguments. What is happening when an argument goes bad? This is very, very different than what most of us have done as undergraduates, because we are used to getting readings from our professors, and our job is to read and understand and learn from those readings, and then to be tested on what we have learned. The LSAT is very different in that, especially in logical reasoning, what you are reading is not something to learn from. It is often, and I don't know that there's a nicer way to put this, it's garbage that is meant to trick you. And so you have to understand when an argument is going bad. The basic idea behind that, or the way that you're critical of an argument, and there are many like subdivisions of this thing, but the basic way an argument goes wrong is the idea behind an argument is you accept the premise is true. If it's a good argument, it's a good reason to believe the conclusion is true. In other words, it leads you to the conclusion. An argument is flawed where even if the premise is true, it does not lead you to the conclusion. In other words, it's entirely possible that the conclusion is still false, even if the premise is true. This is being critical of an argument. And when you are given something to read on the LSAT, you have to push back on what you're reading. This is very, very difficult, and it takes a change of the way you think. So that is one of the reasons studying for the LSAT takes a while, because you are literally adopting a new mindset in order to do it. So having said that, those very broadly are the things that are being tested on the LSAT. Oh, I have a good question here. So let's see. The question is, and I think you should be able to read the question now, which undergraduate courses could help train us to start thinking the right way for the LSAT? I would look for courses like the courses I took were symbolic logic. Sometimes they call them critical thinking courses. Those are very important for stuff on the LSAT. Also, really any philosophy class, like an introductory philosophy class especially, will teach you the principles of argumentation. So I would look into that stuff. That doesn't mean that you need to spend 4 years majoring in philosophy to take the LSAT, but it is a good place to start. So just look at the philosophy portion of the catalog. If you can bring yourself to take several philosophy courses, it will be helpful on the LSAT. Most other things, unfortunately, are not helpful on the LSAT. I'm getting this question. This is an interesting one. How would you feel about economics? I bet that would help you with logic games. I took intro to economics many, many years ago, so I don't really remember too much of what it's about, but I do think it would probably be relevant to logic games. Logic games aren't really mathematical so much, but you are using logic and syllogisms just like you will use in economics. So I do think that would be useful. I don't think it would be as useful as philosophy. Well, here's another good one. Do you believe in taking a cold diagnostic test concerned about discouraging score loss of dopamine? So we do recommend that our students take an initial practice exam, a diagnostic exam. Motivation is part of it, because for some people, being scared at the score that they get back is helpful to motivating them. I do recommend it. I think it's good to get an understanding of the subject matter of the exam before you dive in, and taking a practice exam is helpful. If you're really worried about that score, then maybe don't score it. I hope that you will treat that score as not indicative of your abilities, just as indicative of where you're starting. Okay, there's a number of questions here. Let me get through a little bit more and make sure that we're still moving through the presentation, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time. I will answer these questions, I promise. But I want to just run through these. So like I was saying, the things that are important very broadly are logic and argumentation. Logic is tested very squarely in sufficient and necessary logic. This is diagramming and manipulating if-then statements. Understanding, so these guys are all logic. Quantifiers builds on top of that. Logical opposites is something that a lot of companies, as they are teaching or as they're creating their courses, I think give short shrift to. They'll ask you things, especially in logic games, although it does show up in logical reasoning, they'll ask you things like what must be true, what could be true, what must be false. Each of the following could be true except, each of the following must be false except. All of those are asking you different things. There are different criteria for the right and wrong answers, and just understanding what you are being asked on the LSAT is sometimes half the battle. When it comes to understanding arguments, very importantly, and just about every company tests or teaches you about this, argument structure. But there are ways that arguments go wrong on the LSAT over and over and over again. We actually recently came out with a book called 33 Common LSAT Flaws. The text of that book is available to people who sign up for our course on our website. And it's just ways that the makers of the LSAT make arguments go bad in the same ways again and again and again. Some of them are so common that they happen multiple times on every test. And if you are not finding them, you are leaving points on the table. Understanding how arguments go wrong will help you understand how to strengthen and weaken arguments. To strengthen an argument is to find what's wrong with it and make it better. To weaken an argument is to find what's wrong with it and exploit it. So that's very important. Identifying question type is very important. We have lots of drills for our students about identifying the question types they're dealing with. A lot of times you will get a question that you could answer if you know what kind of question type it is, but the makers of the LSAT don't standardize their question types, or at least the prompt for the question. So they'll ask the same thing in many different ways. And that's something that a lot of times people will be practicing for the LSAT. As they're studying, as they're going through the course, they're doing 50 of the same type of question in a row. So you don't have to learn question type while you're doing that. But then you get socked in the face when you go and do a real LSAT section and you don't know what type of question you're doing. Other things that are very important, time management on all sections of the exam. This is so important that I'll talk about it a little bit today. But also when it comes to logic games, most games ask you to do one or the other of two things, to put things into order, to put things into groups, but there are other types of logic games. So we teach our students about all of those. If you have not started studying for the LSAT, these things will not make much sense to you, but these are very powerful tactics that can be used on lots of different logic games, both to increase your score, but also to make it so that you can get through a logic game faster. And then finally, even though it is not scored, there is a writing sample that will be sent on to the schools you apply to. There was recently a rule change that you can't get your LSAT score until you've taken the writing sample. It's not scored, but it is still important to do well on it. And so I think a good course should teach that as well. All right, so I got through that slide. Now let me answer some of these questions. So I do not know what philosophy, oh, it looks like philosophy 31 logic. So Jacqueline is recommending that if you're going for those philosophy classes that are relevant. Selena asks, is it true that you should only take the LSAT once as scores don't tend to change much? I disagree with that very much. And here's why. So I took the LSAT twice. My score went up by 7 points, which I don't think that's not changing that much. And it was the difference between a score that got me into UCLA and a score that would have not have gotten me into UCLA. But I would also say that I think there's very little danger in taking the LSAT twice. Taking it 3 times, I think, is probably okay. If you start taking it more times than that, I think it can be problematic because law schools will see all the times you take it, and they'll see that you're getting stuck on this one kind of step of applying to law school. But here's why I think you should probably even plan to take the LSAT twice. Law schools are required, so American Bar Association accredited law schools are required to report one LSAT score to the American Bar Association for the students that they admit. And so those scores are reported or are published by the American Bar Association, and ratings agencies like US News and World Report, for better or for worse, are using those numbers in order to rank law schools. And so when it comes to law schools, it is very much in their interest to see those numbers rise, to see their median LSAT score rise, to see their median GPA rise. And so since they're only reporting one score, if you are coming to them with a low score, one that's below their median, and then another high score, one that's above their median, the high score is the one they're going to focus on. So I think it's very low risk to take it more than one time. And my experience and the experience of a lot of students that I have had is that it's not the case that you're stuck at an LSAT score. You're stuck at an LSAT score if you're not thinking about how to personalize what you have learned to make up for your own strengths and weaknesses. So I've taught LSAT for a long time. I taught it before law school and after law school, and that's mostly what I've seen. The people who think about their performance, who try to think creatively about addressing their strengths and weaknesses, are the ones who see a lot of improvement. The ones who just hope that a lot of practice will turn into a better score without thinking critically about their performance are less likely to do better. So I hope that answers that question. If you get a 138 on a practice LSAT, can you still get a 170 plus on the actual LSAT? I've had a student who moved from that score specifically or close to it, 138 or 137, to high 160s over the course of a 2-month course. I don't know what she ended up getting. She might have gotten into the 170s. What I would say is I think it's possible, but I would say that is a very big hill to climb. And the other thing is that you should be thinking about your LSAT score in terms of what score will make you competitive at the schools you're interested in. That has to do with where you're applying, what your GPA is, more than I want this elite LSAT score. Because you can, drive yourself nuts trying to go from a 138 to a 170 plus. If you don't have to do that, then you should set your sights elsewhere. Can you take the LSAT multiple times? For example, if you take a few gap years and you don't like your first initial score? Yes, it used to be that you could only take it, I think, 3 times in any 2-year period, but I believe they have removed that regulation, and I think you can take it as many times as you want. Oh no, you can't see my screen. I'm sorry. I was talking the whole time and my screen went out. Oh my gosh. Sorry. I think I need to make my iPad not go to sleep so quickly. Oh my gosh. Here it is. Sorry, I will pay attention and make sure next time it goes off to bring it back. All right. So there are more questions, but I'm going to try to get through a little bit more of the presentation before I bring up those questions. So time management on the LSAT is very difficult. Again, this is the part of the course, or at least when you're studying for the LSAT, this is what comes later. I think it's important to give yourself a lot of room early on in your course. If it takes you 3, 4, 5 minutes to answer one question as you're learning, that's fine. But ultimately, you're going to have to adopt a very aggressive pace in order to do well on the LSAT. So the LSAT, there are 3 scored 35-minute sections. Starting in August, they're going to bring back the experimental section, which will be 1 more 35-minute section, but it is not scored. It does not count towards your score. So what you get is 1 section of logical reasoning. Logical reasoning questions are each self-contained. There's about 25 questions per section. And so what you would get dividing 35 minutes is about, oh, I already have it written here. You would get about 90 seconds per question. With logic games and reading comprehension, with logic games, you'll get 4 games to complete. And without jumping into what a logic game is for those who are just starting, a logic game basically looks like this. They'll give you a fictional situation. It might be something like 6 runners running a race, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And then they'll give you some rules that govern that situation, like runner B finishes after runner C, and runner D can only finish first or last. And then they'll ask you questions like what must be true, what could be true given those rules. So you'll get 4 of those games. Each one has somewhere between 5 and 7 questions. On a reading comp passage, or on a reading comp section, you'll get 4 passages to read. Each has somewhere between 5 and 8 questions. And since there's 4 each on each of those sections, and again, this is a very aggressive pace, you would get, if you were to divide 35 minutes by 4, you would get 8 minutes and 45 seconds for each game or passage. So that's an aggressive pace. You should not be just spending the average amount of time on each question, however. The idea behind this is you should, for the most part, be picking up all of the points that you are likely to get quickly, that you are likely to get correct, and save the questions that are likely to take more time, but that you're likely to get right for later. And then, and this is something that really like throws people for a loop, because a lot of us who go to law school are perfectionists. There are questions that you are unlikely to get right for most people, that you are unlikely to get right no matter how much time you put into them. Those are questions that ideally you would put 0 minutes and 0 seconds into. You can miss about 10% of questions on the LSAT and still get a 170, meaning you don't have to be perfect. So if you can identify and put those really hard questions, and especially the ones that take a long time and are very hard to the side, you can see improvement in your score by the mechanics of the exam, not necessarily by understanding any better how to answer questions. The way a section usually goes, and this is something you can use to your advantage in order to manage your time intelligently, is that the questions tend to get harder as the section progresses, but they don't put the very hardest questions at the very end. Instead, in a logical reasoning section, there's about 25 questions. The really nasty ones will be around 19, 20, 21. And what they're hoping is that you'll get to that section of the exam, that you'll get bogged down on those questions. You may get those questions wrong, and whether you get them right or wrong, you're still missing the easier points that come later. So the idea in managing your time is to skip around, pick up the easy, quick points. This can also be very hard for lots of us who are perfectionists. But if a question is not working for you, one of the main skills that you have to learn on the LSAT, I would call ego management, which is to bail on a question that is not working for you. I had a very hard time doing that. And so forcing myself to bail on questions that I was not getting right ended up helping me raise my score. But it took a lot of like internal struggle for me to get there. All right, so let me see if I can answer a few more. Do you believe there is a plateau in how high someone can score on the LSAT? A tutor told me that the diagnostic will demonstrate what my limits are and how much more studying and where I should apply to, as you can only improve your LSAT score so much. I mean, I guess what I would say is this. I think the LSAT lines up with the way some people think, and it does less lining up with the way other people think. So if the LSAT lines up with the way you think, then especially with logic games, because people tend to come into logic games and have no idea how to do them, I do think you can see significant improvement. And for some people, that improvement can be straightforward. For other people, it's going to take a lot of work. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. You know, some people work on the LSAT a lot and it doesn't click for them. That may be because they're just not getting the kind of instruction that helps them understand the LSAT. I think a lot of people plateau because they're not understanding or getting information that is helpful to them. I do think that one of the things that the LSAT tests, or one of the things that people miss, is that there's a lot of stuff you can memorize for the LSAT, different argument forms, different flaws. And if you memorize those things and you are actively looking for them, then a question that is hard is easier if you understand that the same structure is being presented. The makers of the LSAT are great at changing the subject matter of what they're doing, but the structures are the same. They pop up over and over and over again. So I think if you never get past the subject matter to the structure, then yes, there is kind of a ceiling on your performance. But if you can start getting to structure rather than subject matter, I don't think there's necessarily a plateau. I mean, after doing this for years, I still think I probably couldn't get a 180 because I think that's really tough. But if you're talking about getting a very good score, seeing a very large score increase, I don't think the LSAT is like there's a cap on your performance. Here's a good question. When is the best time to take the LSAT? How long do you suggest to study? So we did cover how long to study, but what I would say is the best time to take the LSAT is the time that you have the most time to prepare for it. This, for a lot of people, is the summer. Most people study for the LSAT during the summer because most people who are taking the LSAT are college students. And so they have kind of like a lot of free time in the summer. I don't think there is a better LSAT or a worse LSAT to take. Unfortunately, it's curved and there's no like, it's not like the February LSAT is the easy one. I have taken the LSAT twice, but my score was under the medians for my target schools. I'm on various wait lists and I'm thinking of reapplying in the fall. Would admissions officers see taking the LSAT a third time negatively? I don't think so. I think they would see it very positively. I don't think that's a problem. So let me continue on because I know we don't have time for everything and there's still a lot to get to in this presentation. This next one is so important. This is something that I have less expertise on than the other parts of this presentation, but when you're studying for the LSAT, it is really easy to get burned out, to get overwhelmed. And in fact, with how long it takes to study for the LSAT, you should anticipate getting burned out. And in fact, you should plan on getting burned out. So just to keep, caring for yourself, there should be at least one no LSAT day per week while you're studying. When you start dreaming in conditional diagramming, dreaming in if-then statements, it harms not only you, but the relationships with the ones you love. The LSAT, and I know I'm really stepping far outside of my expertise and what this presentation is about, but the LSAT is a test where it is very important to be focused on the task in front of you. It's really easy, especially with reading comprehension, to just kind of zone out, space out. And a lot of times you're zoning out and spacing out because you're bored or you're not understanding or something like that. And so having the ability to focus is incredibly important. People sometimes do that with a meditation practice, but there are exercises to be mindful, to be in the moment, to be focused on what's in front of you. There are lots of apps that help you do stuff like this. So what I would say is that without recommending any particular mode, if you do not have a way of keeping focused, then mindfulness is a way to keep focused. There is a kind of mindfulness that I think goes along with the LSAT, which is what I would call active reading. In logical reasoning or reading comp, what I'm doing, instead of just looking at something and waiting for the answer to jump off the page, I look at what I'm reading as a puzzle to put together. In both reading comp and logical reasoning, there are arguments being made. Arguments have different pieces. And so as I'm reading, instead of just passively absorbing information, I'm saying, okay, where is the conclusion? Oh, that's a conclusion. Well, I know there's got to be some support for a conclusion. So let me find where that is. Oh, here's an experiment that supports that conclusion. Oh, here's a criticism. The author actually doesn't like that argument very much. And so if I see it as pieces of a puzzle to put together, then I'm doing something. And it's easier to stay in the moment while you're doing something like that. And like I was saying, burnout is nearly guaranteed. Put somewhere in your study plan a break, maybe 2-3 weeks before the exam. Have somewhere where you are going to, for at least 2 or 3 days, unplug from the LSAT and then come back to it. I think that's important. Oh boy, 5 minutes left. I think we have to run very quickly. I know there are lots of questions to answer here. I know half of them were about how I left the screen blank. I'm sorry about that. But let me just get, in these last 5 minutes, I've got a couple of tips for each section of the exam. And I'd really like to get through some of these because I think they can be helpful starting right off the road. So with logic games, you always are building a setup in order to represent the information that's given to you. There are standard setups for different game types. For instance, if you are doing a linear game where you're putting things in order, very often your setup should just look like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When you get to harder games, these standard setups won't necessarily do the job by themselves. But if you know standard setups, then you can take what you know and modify it in order to account for the weird rules on the harder games. So I think it's much better to modify standard setups that you already understand than to try to reinvent the wheel as you're doing it. Finding deductions is a lot of the battle in logic games. And a deduction is just where you figure out something about the game that is not explicitly stated. There are a couple of ways to do that. And I think you have to not be letting the, waiting for the deductions to jump off the page. Instead, process of elimination is a common way of making deductions. If there's a variable that shows up in multiple rules, that is a common way of making a deduction. Those things I was talking about, those tactics that we teach our students about creating numerical distributions in scenarios, often those will surface deductions that you would not see if you're just looking at the game. And then finally, with logic games, I would do the if questions first. So they'll say, some questions will just ask you something like, which one of the following must be true? But then some will say something like, in that runners running a race game I was telling you about, something like, if A finishes the race third, which one of the following must be true? Generally, you will build a little hypothetical setup with one of those questions, and you can use that on other questions. It is very helpful. I think the makers of the LSAT are testing your ability to do that, to strategize, use information from one question on another question. With logical reasoning, your first basic task is to determine what you are reading. Most questions in logical reasoning have an argument. Some of them are just a set of facts. But it's important, if it's an argument, to really break it down. There are different question types. They'll ask you to strengthen an argument. They'll ask you to weaken an argument. They'll ask you what's the conclusion. If you're doing all of these things on every argument, then it doesn't matter what question type you're getting. You should be prepared to answer it. So where's the conclusion? What are the premises that support that? By which I mean, get this stuff out of the way, the background and distractions, put it to the side. And then very importantly, is there a common flaw? Arguments on the LSAT go wrong in the same ways over and over and over again. If you know those forms, then you can answer the question about them. We've gotten this question before, and this may be what I have to end on because I don't know if we have time for the reading comprehension stuff. But should you read the question first or should you read the stimulus first? So usually you get a little paragraph and then it'll ask you a question about it. I personally read the question stem first, because they'll ask you things like, what would strengthen the argument? Well, if I know I'm strengthening an argument, one, I know it's an argument in the stimulus, so I have to do my argument analysis. But I also know there's something wrong with it. So I have to find out what's wrong with it so I can strengthen it. That works for me, but for some people, reading the stimulus first is actually better. Because if you read the question stem first, for some people, it's going to narrow your focus. And for some people, you're going to be not thinking or reading broadly enough to get everything in from the passage before you answer the question. So what I would say is, if you don't know which one of those would work better for you, take a practice exam reading the stimulus first, take a practice exam reading the questions first, see which one you do better on. That should give you an indication. I know we're at the last minute, but just the last things I want to say are about reading comprehension. Reading comprehension, I think you will make your life very much easier by treating it as long form logical reasoning, where you just have a very long stimulus with multiple arguments. Argument structure is just as important here. Where are the conclusions? Where are the premises that support it? One of the things that's much different about it is that you're tracking points of view. So there will be different parties in the passage making different arguments. Understand that you are tracking those arguments and that you are being asked about those arguments. Argument structure will tell you what's important. Not everything in the passage is important, but if you know what premises and conclusions are, then you can zero in on those, and you can put the other stuff to the side because you're less likely to be asked about it. So I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that we are now at the end of our presentation. So I'm thinking Katie's going to step in. She is. I thank you so much, Katie, for having us. We really appreciate it.